Welcome to the Surfcast podcast, your weekly source for surf fishing discussions, tactics, interviews, news, and more. The Surfcast podcast is hosted by Jerry Audet and Toby Lapinski, two of the most dedicated and obsessed surf fishermen that you will ever meet. The tide is up, the wind is at our back, so let's hit the surf.
So it was funny the other night, at the end of the night when you're like realizing what I was wearing, what you were wearing, how you're cold, I'm warm, because Jen and I, my wife, fight all the time that I'm always so warm and I'm turning the heats down and she's turning the heats up, and we had that conversation that night.
Yeah, well, the thing is I feel like I'm fairly warm-blooded, and I'm like, you're wearing hiking pants? You're insane. That's insane. It's
December
insane.
fishing. Well, you know.
That's crazy. But hey, so speaking of insane, this is the Surfcast podcast, and I'm Jerry.
And I'm Toby.
And today we've got what going on, Toby?
You know, I got to talk about this because when we were at what you divulged to me was your spring weakfish spot, I was very surprised initially. You know, I hadn't figured it was there. I completely figured or assumed it was some other spot nowhere near where we were. Never, acted upon it, even though I had these assumptions before you told me of where they were. I'm not chasing anybody else's reports or catches or whatever. It's just, I'm beyond that. But, when you first said it, like, this is where I had that weakfish from that story I was telling you. Initially shocked. More I thought about it, though, it really made sense. I see it absolutely as a weakfish spot, and that's why I jumped on it when we started talking about it. And I gotta say, when you told me next spring we're gonna come back and hit this, we're gonna try for it, we're gonna
drag you all the way out there.
You're gonna make me get over there and try for the weakfish, because as I've said, I haven't actually targeted a weakie in, I don't know, maybe 4 years, like directed fishery on them. The problem is that it comes down to the best spring weakfish tides that I'm aware of, where I can relatively easily access, perfectly coincide with some traditionally big striped bass tides, moons, phases, conditions. Like, they mirror each other, even though for me those, like, immediately thinking of one weakfish spot, one striper spot for the spring are, I don't know, 80 miles away from each other, totally different condition. They set up so perfect, so symmetrically, that's why I haven't gone for weakfish the last couple of years.
Yeah, so what months are we talking here, generally?
So this is May. For me,
okay.
It is May that that's when I consider, like, my locale first big shot of stripers, migratories, not holdovers, not the river fish that, you can harass all winter. Those open surf, legit surf bass, and 40-pound plus category with, on that exact scenario, actually produced the biggest surf striper I've ever seen, which was over 55 pounds by one of the guys that I fish with. So I'm like, do I fish these tide windows that have produced for me multiple 40-pound fish, a guy that I fish with a 55-pound striped bass? Do I try for that? Or do I take a little bit of drive and I got a shot at like 10, 11, 12, maybe a 14-pound weakfish?
Which is giant.
Yeah. I mean, there was one night, so a couple years back, I wanted to go for weakfish. Like, it was one of the springs that I was actually targeting them. I was making some concerted effort to go try for weakfish. And I had a couple of little guys, and it was kind of getting out of my system, but we were approaching the moon, the perfect scenario conditions at this spot, and the bite was improving. Some bigger bait was rolling in, because that's the other thing with that spring weakfish bite. They're coming into spawn, so you got these bigger fish rolling in, and when you add in like adult bunker showing up, that's when you got a legit shot at a 10, 12, maybe even like 14-pound weakfish, which is bigger than anything I've had. Best I've done on weakfish is 12 pounds, which is a solid fish. But so we were approaching that like perfect scenario, and my buddy Chris was like, dude, you got to come with us tonight. 3 of us going. Everything is right. And I remember, like, I was back and forth. Do I go? Things are also perfect at that striped bass spot. Like, this is the window. it's supposed to be this wind condition. It's the first day of the wind change. It's going to be like this for a few days. You know what? I decided I'm just going to stick to my striper. I'm going to go to my striper spot that night, because I figured give it a shot. If the striper bombs that night, I'll just go hit the weakfish tomorrow night. It was my plan.
Okay, right. That's good.
So I feel comfortable, confident, and I don't even think about the weakfish the whole night that I'm fishing. And I'm fishing with my other buddy, Jay, and we're working the rip. He casts a needlefish out. Bang, hooks into a good fish. It goes down, he moves down the beach to give me the opportunity to cast on it. Because one thing we run into, too, at this spot in the spring is they'll come through in real small pods, those bass. You'll get a 5-minute window that you might have schoolies before or nothing. All of a sudden, there's just like this pod of better fish. And I kind of theorize it's part of those post-spawn Hudson or maybe that I didn't spawn Hudson fish because the big ones don't spawn every year, and like there's this little push that comes through. So I think they're in these little couple of fish. I can't imagine there's a lot of them at that size. I'd love to know that, but I theorize, there's like, let's say 6 of them in front of me anytime. They come through and you have your quick window. So anyway, Jay gets his hooks. He's fighting it. Gives me the okay. I cast 2 cranks. I get doubled down. We landed our fish. I think his was 46 pounds and mine was 44 pounds. Took a couple pictures, shoot them off. We're psyched. I think we had a couple.
I would guess so.
Yeah, I mean, I'm back essentially on back-to-back casts right next to each other. We hit that pod, which further goes into my theory of there's these little pods of those fish that stick together in that time frame. We fished the rest of the night. I don't recall specifically anything else happening. I know we didn't get any more big fish like that, but I still wasn't thinking weakfish. Like I had forgotten about that initial plan.
Yeah, I would say that would erase it from your memory.
Yeah, I mean, these fish are eating 10-pound weakfish if they want to.
Right.
But I get back to my truck eventually that night and I hop in. I start to drive and I see a text had been on my phone, pops up, so I check it. Chris and the 2 other guys hammered the weakfish. They had, I think the biggest was like 14.6 pounds, if I remember correctly, and then Chris and the other guy both had like 13-pound class fish or 12-pound, like quality weakfish. And I texted Chris, told him what we did, and we ended up having this conversation, and it like developed into what am I going to do every year? And that's why it might have been the last spring. Now that I think of it, might be longer since I targeted him because I can't break away from my spring striper for the weakfish on those nights when they're so perfectly matched.
Yeah.
It's and that runs into what we were talking with that spot the other night. Like, I didn't really start, hammering you on what the conditions are that would set up there, but I know for a fact why the fish are going to be in there. So the moon's going to be the same as my striper spot. So now I'm going to be debating in my head, and we'll be debating what to do.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, right? And like, if we're talking weakfish and 40-pound bass, like that's all we're talking about. We're not talking about bass and if I should, maybe take the night off previous so that I can fish more for my small stream trout or something. If we're just talking weakfish and we're talking surf striper, man, it's not a hard call for me. I'm going to pick the striper every time. But I'm going to tell you that so if we're talking 40-pound bass or even 30-pound bass, maybe even 20-pound bass, even if you're talking a 15-pound weakfish, we're really talking something special.
Mm-hmm.
For me, the striper in the surf, as we'll talk about many, many times, and I'll repeat myself over and over, I'm sure, there's something that transcends all of it that it just speaks to me. So that's why I'm doing it, right? That's why I built my career now around it. That's why we're doing this podcast.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say, for me, the hard part is when I'm going to fly fish. So if I'm going to fly fish and I'm going to choose to go fly fish an estuary, an open surf, not usually, although that's not really true, but not usually a boulder field that time of year. It's not that I don't fish a boulder field, it's that I wouldn't fly fish in the boulder field that time of year. It just doesn't really work out that way. Maybe I should, honestly. I'm saying it out loud right now, and I guess I haven't really even thought about it. So maybe I should. I did. This is live and in the moment, folks, because I didn't really think about it till right this second. But for me, oftentimes there's a period in there where I'm still in a transition between, I'm not as early as you. So like I got a weird little window in there where like I can target big, and then I'm sort of fly fishing still for smaller fish, and I might hit one and then do the other, and I might do them like back to back. That fly fishing becomes the question, because I know that this spot and others produce weakfish. I know because I got a really nice one in 2020 on the fly. I don't know how big it was, but it was, I have a photo of it. It certainly wasn't 10 pounds. It was probably 6 or 7 or something, but it was bigger than average for sure. Mm-hmm. And especially on a fly, and it was amazing. And it made the whole month, and honestly, it set up the whole season, and it was the best thing I've caught in the surf since I hooked that sturgeon with my friend, which was a whole nother story maybe we'll talk about. And honestly, I was like, man, it's crazy to think that the season just started and I got the best fish of the year. I don't think I'm going to beat this, because it was so awesome to be getting this, in the surf. It's rare, but not rare. You know what I mean?
In New England, southern New England, right. I consider weakfish over like those little, 12, 14-inch ones rare.
Right. Exactly.
It's an event.
Right. Exactly. So this is a solid 20+ inch fish. This was a good fish. That becomes a question for me, and I'm gonna shout out to him right now. Jimmy Fee, man. He's the one who has an influence on me, because he is always on that hunt for that super rare Cape weakfish. And he does it every year, and he goes out and he says, here's my waste of time. I'm going to go out, I'm going to waste some time because I know it's a waste of, but I'm going to, I'm always hearkening back to so-and-so year when they were in, and, I caught so-and-so. And he always goes back, and it strikes me in my heart. Like, I'm like, man, God, yeah, he's right. It is rare, and like the season's not going full throttle yet, and I'm not going to be like, I got the whole season ahead of me. But ultimately, man, I'm with you. I end up not choosing to do it. I end up bailing on the whole idea of it.
It's like hard. It's what really makes it hard for me too, is kind of like you're saying, you're in that little window we're talking, you're still kind of in a transition point. It really coincides. That little moon window coincides with the switch, that hard switch where I go from my spring warm-up mentality of, I'll go out here and there. I don't care what I'm stretching, like getting refamiliarized with hitting the surf. Probably bringing my son a couple of times, like it's laid back, but it'll be one day to the next where I flip that switch and go all in, and that's right when it coincides. So it's like even harder. It's like if I was balancing, let's say if it was, the previous moon earlier, where I'm still in that like schooly warm-up phase, it would probably be easier for me in that case to opt for the weakfish.
Exactly.
If the quality of the weakfish was that later stage, that let's call 10-pound plus likelihood, versus, if I could top out at 15, 18-pound striper in that early stretch, I'm doing really good. So like weighing those two, there's some point in there for me that, let's call the 10-pound weakfish mark, 10 above. Once I can maybe get a 25-pound plus striper, right. Now it's how to offsets it. Of, weakfish has got it, and the striper hits that 25, because, they're not both 10s, but like that weight hits, and now it's striper's got it, and that's where I'm going, and I'm not even thinking about it.
Right.
And I wish that I would more easily go for the weakfish, because they're cool. Like, it's funny you brought up Jimmy and that weakfish bite he tries to replicate. I've told him a couple times, like when they did that episode of their TV show in the daytime, it was like him and I think Chris Smeagol was with him, and they're hitting the weakfish in the daytime on the Cape. Like I messed around, like that was so cool, like to see that going on. Yeah. But he comes from Jersey too, so he knows, that Jersey weakfish fishery is way better than what we have in New England.
Right.
So he's coming up with what, he's bringing his knowledge and experience on them there, applying them here, and figured out this bite. which that's the coolest kind of stuff too.
Yeah.
To be able to transfer that up, and I need him to come fish my areas and tell me where the weakfish are going to be where I live.
Yeah, it's that transference. The other thing I'm thinking when we're talking about this too is I'm going to give someone else another shout out, and that's Dave Anderson. He is the one who says it to me all the time. He goes, everything happens at once. Everything happens at once in May. And it sucks because you can't be everywhere at once. And, a lot of people talk about the urgency they feel in the fall. I feel that too, but it's more like depression. I feel the urgency and the stress in the spring. And it's like, take a deep breath and you'll exhale sometime in June, probably actually the second week of July. And during that time, it's small stream and it's good largemouth and it's pike and it's all this stuff. And I'm doing a solid chunk of my travel, to Maine and to points elsewhere. And it all happens at once. And it almost becomes a prioritization, right? And it's not even a decision. It's like, for me, it's a mindset I've set up. Maybe it's not actually, you know what? Again, having not thought this through maybe enough, I don't even know if it's a decision. If it's more just, it's a gut thing. And I don't mean a gut thing like, oh, it's going to be better stripers tonight or better. It's just, this is what feeds me. Like this just feels better. And so there's no real decision to be made. And maybe if the stripers are late, or the biggest thing, this is the biggest thing, and this is really the last thing I have to say. If I get a really solid fish, if I've had like a kick-ass, beginning of May or whatever, into May, I'm much more apt to be like, okay, satiated. I don't, I got that 40, I got a couple 30s, great. Now I can do whatever I want until the next new moon because I'm free. Because I love the surf, but like you're saying, there's some really satisfying things you can do in the surf that maybe aren't the best. But man, I got that weird trophy collection, sort of check the box mentality. If I get that nice fish, I'm psyched. I'm like, oh, thank God. Now I'm free to do what I actually want.
As you're saying it, I'm thinking it through, and I'm like, yeah, same. Like I could check that off and move on. Like let's say on that first night, I would get the big striper, and but in my example I started with, no, I fished that striper spot the next couple of nights until the conditions totally changed, and I don't think I did anything else worthwhile. So in theory, I'm like, yeah, I would get the striper and then be easy and all right, cool, nice, go after the weakfish for the next few days. Because I do remember that weakfish bite kept up, and I kicked myself for not just going, but I couldn't get away. Like I did the checkbox. All right, May 40. Well, now the checkbox is 2 May 40s or a 40 and a 50. Like it's never enough. It's like that little addiction comes in. And if I hadn't done anything on the night that I went and those guys hammered the weakfish, I also wouldn't have been able to go for. I'm like, nah, man, they're going to be there tomorrow night. Then I was just a day early. It's once I get to that balance of what is the shot of the fish I could get, for me right now, my mentality, there's no decision.
Same.
This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast podcast. You can find out more about the podcast and find more episodes at surfcastpodcast.com. And be sure to check us out on social media at the Surfcast Podcast.